I'm thrilled to be kicking off a new six-part series in partnership with the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario here on What She Said. We'll be exploring crucial topics over the next several months, including the gender wage gap, pay equity versus equal pay for equal work, the gender pension gap, and navigating employment law for women. Today, though, Commissioner Katie Phelp joins me for a Pay Equity Commission 101 of sorts to set the foundation for this enlightening journey ahead. Welcome to What She Said, Katie.
Thank you for having me.
So here's a fun fact. Ontario was the first government globally to create a
hmm
Pay Equity Act that covers workers in both the public and private sectors. So let's take it all the way back to the beginning. How did this happen?
That is a really fun fact, and I like to share that fact because that's not something a lot of people know. Um, but our act came into force in the late 80s, and if you think about what was happening in the world in the 1980s, there was a lot. We're talking about third wave feminism, and a lot of sort of cultural zeitgeist around women's empowerment. You can think about, the 9 to 5 film, infamous song, which is also linked to a union, the National Association of Working Women across the US. And so this film, this pop culture moment started to create this movement of women empowerment and women's equity movements in the workforce. And then you had other pop culture things like the Working Girl movie with Harrison Ford and Melanie Griffith. I don't know if you remember that, or even The Color Purple
It's
with
one of
Whoopi
my favorite
Goldberg.
movies. One of my
Yes,
favorite movies is Working Girl. Yeah.
yes. And when you think about it, you think like, well, why are we starting this conversation with pop culture? But that's because pop culture drives social discourse, and social discourse drives voter preferences and voter behaviors. So governments are going to be responding to that. So there was this sort of zeitgeist moment where you have, Cyndi Lauper singing Girls Just Want to Have Fun. Eurythmics, Sisters Are Doing It for Themselves. Donna Summer, She Works Hard for the Money. Like Joan Jett, Bad Reputation. All these cultural things happening, changing the conversation around women and work and equity. And so, the 80s was sort of this upbeat time and upbeat prospects about having a more equal society. And women were they were advocating for themselves for equality at work. They were also advocating for bigger social problems like poverty reduction, anti-racism movements, full inclusion movements. So there was this sort of cultural zeitgeist at the moment that I think allowed for the I would say the political will or the political motivation for governments to come together and say that this is a viable moment for us to create a piece of legislation. And that's actually what happened. There was a unique moment in Ontario, at least. In 1985, we formed a coalition government that's never happened again. Maybe will never happen again between the NDP and Liberals. And part of that coalition's agreement was that they agreed to create a Pay Equity Act that covered a concept called equal pay for work of equal value, which we're going to keep talking about throughout this series because it's a concept that really defines what is pay equity. And so they moved really quickly. I mean, this coalition came together June 85. By November 85, they actually published a paper on what pay equity could look like in Ontario. That was November 85. By January 1986, they ran public consultations and then moved very quickly creating the legislation. It was first introduced late 1986. Obviously, when you introduce any piece of legislation of this sort and size, there's going to be debate, revisions, all of that fun stuff. But by essentially January 1st, 1988, we had a Pay Equity Act. And this was the first government globally to actually have a Pay Equity Act, as you said, that covered equal pay for work of equal value and applied to both the public and private sectors. So, at the moment, I can't really emphasize how momentous this was, not just for Ontario, but globally, setting a new standard and a new precedent because the Ontario Act brings together the sort of the best of or parts of HR law, compensation law, employment law, human rights, HR, I meant sort of previously human resources. So it's a really robust, rich act. And it came into force because of the political will at the time, but also I would say, grassroots advocacy and the sort of pop culture zeitgeist where you saw a lot of conversations happening about women's empowerment.
I'm going to just go a little bit off topic here because it is Women's History Month. Any notable women we should be giving a shout out to thank for this incredible act?
Good question. I mean, it's hard to point to one woman or person because there were so many groups advocating for this, that it's hard to say, well, here's the person who led it, because it was just like, this was really a result, I would say, of 20 years of grassroots activism. Ursula Franklin was a professor at the U of T who published a lot of academic research in this space, and I know that our office in the early days leaned heavily on her research to help with the sort of policy formation. So, there's, you've got to think of like the social activists and the journalists and everybody who was writing about this, kind of created enough of a wave and a momentum to push it over the edge.
Yeah, I love looking at moments like this because it gives me hope for the future as well in creating these moments to change things that we don't like. What is the
Exactly.
what is the purpose of the Pay Equity Act then? What are the guiding principles that you follow?
That's a good question, because, simply, or the policy language is that the purpose of the act is to redress systemic discrimination in compensation for work performed by employees in female job classes. And we'll get into that because that's kind of a little bit confusing. But it unapologetically recognized that the labor market had been sex segregated. There were certain jobs that men did and certain jobs women did, and the jobs that women tended to do were valued less in the economy for a lot of reasons we're going to get into later in this conversation today, I'm sure, but also we'll get into this over the next 6 episodes that we have conversation with. But that was the purpose, was to redress this like long-term systemic discrimination of jobs that were classified as or stereotyped as quote unquote women's work. There were some guiding principles that shape the way, any policy has to have a framework and how that's going to operate. And a couple of things, this policy regulates all employers across Ontario, which is a significant number of employers. We're talking in the tens of thousands. So it was designed to be, I would say, proactive and self-managed. So the founding principle is that workplaces actually bear the primary responsibility for eliminating gender-based pay discrimination. And this is a self-managed process. So every company has to go through and do a pay equity analysis and go through the audit process. So it's sort of like a thou shalt, like here's the
Right.
commandment, go forth and do it. So it's proactive in that way. It's also reactive, though, because we respond to complaints. Workers across Ontario, regardless of gender, by the way, if you're in an occupation that's stereotyped or has historically or traditionally been held as a female job, you can apply under the Act. So understanding, though, that reactive nature is both part of it, because we proactively push this, but we also respond reactively to complaints from individuals in the labor market. We also recognize that, there's obviously limited public resources to effectively enforce an act like this, right? So that is why we actually have that reactive, or I would say complaint driven approach, because we educate employers and say, hey, it's your responsibility. It's incumbent on you to manage this process and create it. Well, we know they're not all going to do that. So we respond with a complaint driven approach, and which is an effective way to manage enforcement when you have such a large employment and labor market that you have in Ontario that we're regulating. We've also, the Pay Equity Act was founded on, I would say, best practices in terms of legislation, which understands that if you give workplace parties, so especially, unions and labor representation, to work together to resolve disagreements on their own, you're likely going to see more effective outcomes for everyone. And so the Act allows for that. So there's an important piece there where I think that, especially Ontario has a high rate of unionization. So allowing for unions and employers to negotiate amongst themselves and come up with a pay equity plan and strategy that works, that obviously is in line with the law, is a really effective way to do this. I would say the founding principle is also gender neutrality. We have a lot of ways of looking at and sort of degendering jobs, as sort of like bias thread that was put on them. And so gender neutrality in terms of doing job evaluation, and we create a lot of tools and we educate employers on how to actually do that. And, finally, we focus on equal pay for work of equal value, which acknowledges that, men and women have done different work over time because of sex-based discrimination. But we valued certain jobs more than others. And so the Act seeks to redress that and say, let's actually get down to, we can compare apples and oranges. We're not talking about two people on a line moving widgets. We're talking about people doing different jobs in an organization, but maybe one is undervalued because it's been dominated by women.
This act is 37 years old, almost as old as me.
Me too. Me too.
So, but some might say the labor market has changed a lot in 37 years. So does it still serve its purpose?
Yes, it does. I mean, obviously I'm going to say that, but it does. The labor market has changed a lot. And even if you think about the last 50 to 100 years, I won't, go through all that. We don't have the time. But, as I've already mentioned, post-war industrialization, 1930s, jobs were highly sex segregated. And there was actually laws participating, or limiting, I should say, participation for both men and women. Women did certain types of jobs, men did other jobs. But mostly women were affected by these jobs because there were, laws that said that limited working hours for women in order to give men more, or to protect, what was understood as the sensibilities of women at the time, or limited sectors they could work in. Or in fact, even in the 1970s in some of the US states and Canada, we had marrying teacher laws that said if you were a teacher and you got married, you had to resign. So, there's legal frameworks that have mostly, first of all, there's legal frameworks that created these sort of inequalities.
Right.
And yes, most of them are gone. By and large, they're gone. However, the legacy of those persists. And that takes time. It takes time to have cultural and economic shift. And if you think about it, men and women have only been working together for about 70 years. Like that's when the desegregation really started to break down. And so obviously it's going to take time. And we have seen noticeable progress in breaking down segregation, women moving into more male dominated spheres, men moving into more female dominated spheres. So as we break down that clustering, that's great, but we're not quite there yet. And so the Act continues to serve that purpose of addressing it.
And you touched on this a little bit, but I think it's really important to sort of drive this point home. It's not the Pay Equity Commission is not just for women, correct?
Right. No, it's not. It's for every employee.
Yeah. So you serve, and especially I think non-binary workers, people who identify as trans. I know that trans people in particular have a really hard time finding employment. So you help these people as well, right?
The Act applies to every worker. What we look at is the gender of a job class. So as I said, because of the kind of highly sex segregated labor market that was created with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the paid labor market, jobs were gendered, male and female, and that's largely because the social discourse in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century was male female, and that we had this very binary workforce. And that is what persists today. So it's not about the gender of the person, or their gender identity. It's about the gender and gender identity of the job class, or the way that it has been gendered over time. And thankfully, the gender's sort of segregation is breaking down, which is good. When we see that disappearing is maybe when the Act starts to be irrelevant, because it means we're starting to reach parity. But at this point, we still have predominantly the lingering of the predominantly male and female job classes. And I hope we never get to a day where we, see the creation of non-binary or trans job classes, because that means we have failed as a society and as a labor market, because that would mean that certain individuals are clustered into certain jobs based on their gender identity. And so we don't see that happening right now. We still see the persistence of predominantly male and female gender job classes. And so anybody can apply. We've had men apply. We've had non-binary individuals apply. We've seen the whole spectrum of personal identities apply. But what matters in the process is how the job class has been gendered. We look at current incumbency. We look at the historical incumbency of that job class. And then, of course, the stereotype, how it is viewed in society. And we use that as our basis. So absolutely, the Act can serve all working Ontarians.
All right, incredible. Katie, you are always sharing great information on the website, but you also there's ways for people to get in touch with you there. Can you share best places for people to find you and to follow along with what you are sharing on social media?
We are very active. We have a strong LinkedIn community. So I think people can look up Pay Equity Office of Ontario on LinkedIn and join us and follow us. We share a lot of information there. We have a great podcast series. If your listeners want to learn more, levelthepayingfield.ca, and of course, payequity.on.gov.ca is a great spot to get all our information.
All right, incredible. I'm going to put that all these links in the blog post when this goes live on whatshesaidtalk.com, and we will see you next month.
Excellent. Thank you.